All right, welcome back to part 2 of the Corinthians video. In this video, we're going to quickly run through several of the problems and the issues that the Corinthians were having in the church about how to live the Christian life, and then Paul's gospel advice to help them out. So we'll begin here with church issues and divisions in the body. We've already talked about this. Paul writes that there are divisions in the body, and he doesn't like it, because people are following different pastors, as we've mentioned. What causes this is just human wisdom. Paul says here that these people are worldly. They're mere infants. There's jealousy and quarreling among each other. In other words, they're acting like a bunch of children. And so Paul is disappointed that there are these cliques in the church and divisions among people. His gospel solution is to use a couple of metaphors. He says, you are all God's fellow workers, and the leaders in the church, Paul and Apollos and Peter, are just servants of Christ, and they're all working towards the same goal, and it doesn't matter who's doing what. The leaders are just servants. And so he uses the metaphor of a field and a building. Here he writes, he says, the Lord has assigned each his task. Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. And so we're all just fellow workers. We're all just God's field. We're all God's building. We leaders are nothing. We're just servants serving Jesus Christ. So there ought not to be these divisions and cliques in the church. This is actually from 1 Corinthians 12, where he refers to the church as a body, so that there may be no division among you. Just as the body has many parts, so the church has many parts, but they're all working towards the same goal. The next issue involves moral issues, and here it involves sexual immorality. Unbelievably, sexual immorality is happening in the church among Christians. And of course, the question is, why is that happening? How could that even be possible? Well, the answer is that we need to talk for a minute about Gnosticism. This is a Greek philosophy that infiltrated the Christian church in Corinth, because many of the converts to Christianity in Corinth were Gentile and pagan and secular. They had been raised in this Greek philosophy called Gnosticism. And Gnosticism said that the spiritual world is good and the material world is bad. Now, if you have that kind of idea or philosophy, then what you might conclude is that, well, then it doesn't really matter what we do with our bodies, because our bodies are physical and the material world is bad. So who cares what you do with your bodies? It doesn't really matter as long as you're okay in your spiritual life. And so sexual immorality was happening in the church. And Paul's answer is to exercise church discipline against these people. Here's the text in 1 Corinthians 5. It's actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that doesn't even occur among pagans. A man has his father's wife, which is obviously horrible. It's sexual deviance and certainly shouldn't be happening in the church. Furthermore, Paul says you're proud of this. And of course, this all goes back to this idea about Gnosticism, that the physical material world doesn't matter, so what we do with our bodies is just fine. And Paul uses an unusual term. He says, hand this man over to Satan, whoever's doing this. Put this person out of the fellowship. That just means sort of exclude the person in terms of church discipline, obviously in the hope that they'll be restored. But Paul's answer is, if this activity is persistent and the person is unrepentant, they ought to be handed over to Satan. That is, to be alone with their sin, in hopes that then they'll realize what they've done and come back to the fellowship. Here he says in that passage, expel the wicked man from among you. Another moral issue involved taking people to court. because Corinth was such a commercial center with business and trade. There were a lot of legal issues, a lot of legal lawsuits that people would bring against each other, bringing people to court. And this seems to be happening now among Christians in the church in Corinth. And so Paul's gospel answer says, if you have a dispute with somebody else, don't take it before the ungodly. In other words, don't take it before secular judges, because they don't understand. They don't have biblical values in mind. In fact, Paul's gospel answer is quite radical and unusual. He says, instead of going to court against each other, he says, why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Now, that's quite unusual, because we're people who want to make things right, and we hate injustice, and we want to take people to court and fix it. But here, Paul says, why not just take one for the team? Why not just be wronged or cheated? Now, obviously, Paul doesn't mean that we need to tolerate serious injustice or abuse, but his answer is, instead of taking people to court all the time, maybe just be wronged and say, okay, and go on. Now, why would he say that? Well, several reasons here at the bottom. Number one, secular judges are not sensitive to Christian values. They don't care about the church or Christian values. Secondly, the basis for litigation is often revenge. And obviously, an attitude of revenge and getting back at people and getting even with people is not something that Christians ought to be doing. And then thirdly, he says, lawsuits make the church look bad. It's not a very good witness for Christians to be going into secular courtrooms to settle disputes. Instead, he says, why not just be wronged? At least in this case, to preserve the integrity of the church. Another moral issue is libertarianism. Libertarianism just sort of means, just living with no rules, doing whatever you want, whenever you want. Isn't that what we can do, Paul? We have freedom as Christians. And here Paul addresses that in 1 Corinthians 6. It says, everything is permissible for me. Now, in that case, I think Paul is actually quoting something that the Corinthians are saying. They're saying to Paul, hey, Paul, everything is permissible, right? We can be libertarian. We can do whatever we want. Isn't that right, Paul? Well, Paul's response is, well, yeah, we have freedom, but not everything is beneficial. They say it again. Everything is permissible, right, Paul? But Paul responds, but I will not be mastered by anything. Certainly we have Christian freedom in the church as Christians, but we can't just do anything because not all things are beneficial. And certainly some things can master us. I'll just give you an example. Maybe video games or television or the internet or Facebook or any other kind of social media. We can do these things, but maybe it's not always beneficial. And maybe we can be mastered by those things. And so Paul says we need to be careful about those things. He especially says we need to be careful about what we do with our bodies. He says, do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? And here he said you ought to flee from sexual immorality because our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. In regard to libertarianism, Paul's answer is, yeah, Christ forgives, but that shouldn't be an excuse to continue sinning. Secondly, some actions are not sinful, but they can control us, and we have to be careful about that. Actually, some actions can hurt other people, so we especially have to be mindful of the things that we do then. And then finally, with regard to sexual purity, Paul says we should honor God with sexual purity because our bodies belong to God. So a third area of issues are practical issues. And here Paul talks about marriage and divorce and singleness. And again, just to remind you of Gnosticism, because this is going to involve sexuality and our bodies within marriage. That Greek philosophy, Gnosticism, which said the spiritual world is good and the material world is bad. Here's the text in 1 Corinthians 7. Paul says, now for the matters that you wrote about. Apparently the Corinthians had written to Paul about the issue of marriage. And I think this is another quote from the Corinthians. It is good for a man not to marry, or more literally, touch a woman. Right, Paul? It's good for us not to get married because sexuality is bad. Now, here's the other side of that Gnosticism. On the one hand, people could say that our physical bodies don't matter, so we can do whatever we want sexually. Here, these people are saying the opposite. They're saying that since our physical bodies don't matter, sexuality is a bad thing, and we ought not to do it. Right, Paul? And so Paul addresses the issue of sexuality in marriage. And he says, but since there's so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. That is, the answer within marriage is that there should be one man, one woman, one lifetime. And we need to manage our sexuality well. It's something that God has given us, and we need to treat it in a godly way. Here Paul goes on in 1 Corinthians 7. He says, the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. That is, he's talking about sexual intimacy, and we ought to share that just within the context of marriage. So Paul's gospel answer to sexuality and how to manage that within marriage is to, number one, stay married, each giving to the other in mutual submission. And the remedy for sexual immorality isn't don't touch, but rather the opposite. Have a healthy marriage where there's mutual submission and sharing and sensitivity for each other. And then Paul adds, and don't get divorced. That's not an answer either. And then Paul gives a little teaching on divorce. Here's 1 Corinthians 7. He said, a wife must not separate from her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. Apparently what the Corinthians were saying, again, because of Gnosticism and that the physical world is bad, is that, wow, since we're married and sexuality then is part of the physical world and bad, maybe we should just get divorced. Right, Paul? And Paul's answer is no, that's not the answer. Don't get divorced. Then he goes through several situations regarding divorce. Here he says, if a brother has a wife who is not a believer, in other words, if a Christian, a believer, has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. In other words, Paul says, if a Christian is married to a non-Christian, and the non-Christian wants to stay in the marriage, then the believer should not get divorced and should preserve the marriage. In other words, having an unbelieving spouse is not a reason for divorce. Now that's kind of difficult to understand, but that's what Paul says. You need to stay in the marriage if the unbeliever wants to stay, obviously in hopes that you'll have a positive influence on that person. Obviously, Paul would say in other places, not in Corinthians, but elsewhere, he would say that's a great reason to, first of all, marry a believer in the first place, because you don't want to end up in a situation where one partner is a Christian and one is not, because that's going to be very difficult on the marriage. But Paul says you need to stay married if the unbeliever wants to stay. Here Paul goes on, though, to add, but if the unbeliever leaves and wants to leave, let it be so. So here's one of the biblical reasons for divorce. In the Gospels, we hear that one reason is adultery. Here, there's a second reason that Paul gives, and that is abandonment. If an unbelieving spouse wants to leave and initiates the separation and divorce, then let it be so. But as a believer, you shouldn't initiate the divorce. You ought to stay married. So, to those with an unbelieving spouse, remain married. To those with an unbelieving spouse who wants to leave, let them go. And then, Paul teaches on singleness. Here he says in 1 Corinthians 7, it is good for them to stay unmarried. He goes on in 1 Corinthians 7. He says it's good to be maybe unmarried in some cases, because an unmarried person is concerned about the Lord's affairs and how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of the world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. So Paul says that the value of singleness is that you can better serve the church, or better serve the Lord, or better serve the family of God. So there is a value to remaining single, and you can be of more service to the church. And here he says the same thing about women. An unmarried woman can be about the Lord's affairs. So this is obviously a big issue today in the church, which seems to value marriage and only value marriage. But here Paul says that there is a value to singleness. It's a gift. And you can serve the family of God with your gift of remaining single. So Paul says that with singleness, there's a great benefit, a benefit to the church and to the family of God. Just to summarize his advice on all these things, here's 1 Corinthians 7. He says, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord has assigned them. In other words, if God has sort of planned for you to be married, then stay married. If he's assigned you to be single, then stay single. Each one should remain in the situation that God has called him. Now that's difficult sometimes, but this is Paul's teaching on singleness and marriage. By the way, a really good book on singleness, and in this case, same-sex attraction and living out a single celibate life as a Christian. A good book on that is this one right here. You might want to look it up, by Ed Shaw. Ed Shaw is a same-sex attracted Christian, and he has chosen a single life, and he has chosen to remain celibate. And he just gives some biblical reasons for his choices. So I would highly recommend that book if you're interested in this topic. Another issue that the Corinthians were concerned about was meat offered to idols. In Corinth, because it was a commercial center, there was a lot of trade, and meat and other items would be brought in, and they would be sort of sacrificed to a pagan idol in the marketplace. And so the Christians are wondering, should we eat this meat that's offered to an idol, or should we not eat this meat that's offered to an idol? And here Paul gives his advice in 1 Corinthians 8. He says, we know that an idol is nothing, and that there is no God but the one God that we serve. But he says, be careful about the exercise of your freedom, and do not become a stumbling block to the weak. Paul says, therefore, if what I eat causes my brother to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause him to fall. In other words, Paul says, look, as a Christian, we know that idols are nothing. If some Christians feel free to eat the meat, then let them do so. That's fine. But there may be other Christians who are a little bit more sensitive to that and feel like they shouldn't eat that meat. And Paul says, in that case, don't flaunt your freedom and don't become a stumbling block to the weak. Maybe the equivalent in our culture is the issue of alcohol. Should a Christian drink alcohol? Well, many Christians feel free to be able to do that, and we have that freedom in Christ. But there are some who are a bit more sensitive. And Paul would say, in that case, don't flaunt your freedom and don't cause a weaker person to stumble. So the next issue involves liturgical issues, or issues revolving around worship in the church. And the Corinthians had many questions about public worship. For example, can women participate in worship? I mean, remember Corinth had the temple of Aphrodite with all of these female prostitutes who dressed a certain way and acted in obviously very ungodly ways. And the Corinthians are wondering, well, can Christian women be part of Christian worship? And Paul answers, well, yes, they can, but Christian worship should be distinguished from the pagan worship. And men and women must be their truly created selves. In other words, Christian men should act like Christian men, and Christian women should dress and act like Christian women. But men and women can each contribute to the life of the ministry in a Christian community. So Paul says, yeah, men and women can participate in worship, but men ought to look and act like men, women ought to look and act and dress like women, and it certainly ought to be distinguished from the pagan worship of the goddess Aphrodite. Another liturgical issue involved the sacraments, the body and blood of Christ. And in the first century Christian church, communion wasn't just a small piece of bread and a cup of juice. It actually involved a meal where there was sharing, and especially where the rich would share with the poor, and food would be shared with everybody in the community as a symbol of their unity and fellowship in Jesus Christ. And apparently what was happening in Corinth was that poor people and disadvantaged people were being excluded, and they weren't getting the food that they needed. And so Paul says this ought not to be. We ought to celebrate our unity in Jesus Christ, especially when we're celebrating communion. And the gospel answer that Paul gives is we ought to think of the Christian church as a body with many members. Everyone is necessary, just like a hand is necessary and an eye is necessary on the body. The Christian church is a body, the body of Christ, and everybody is valuable, and everybody ought to be part of that unity. And then finally, there were doctrinal issues in the Corinthian church. One of them involved spiritual gifts. Apparently, what was happening in Corinth is that there were several people who were exercising the more supernatural gifts of speaking in tongues and healing and so on. And they were kind of using it as kind of a spiritual measuring rod, that you weren't really a true Christian unless you exhibited these spiritual sort of power gifts. And so Paul gives a teaching on spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14. And what he says is that, yeah, there are a variety of gifts. There are many different gifts that people have, including those supernatural power gifts. But Paul says people ought to seek the higher gifts. In fact, the gifts are sort of ranked in Corinthians. And so here in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul says people in the church should desire the higher gifts, especially the gift of prophecy. The gift of prophecy really was just sort of preaching the gospel. It wasn't fortune telling or looking into the future. People ought to value the gift of prophecy because it benefited and edified the church, whereas the gift of speaking in tongues was a more private gift that only edified and built up the individual. Paul would prefer people to have gifts that benefited the whole body, such as the gift of preaching, or as he calls it here, prophecy. The next thing he says about spiritual gifts is that there are 3 gifts that are superior, and he mentions those in the well-known passage in 1 Corinthians 13. So here's that text in 1 Corinthians 13. He says, "Now these 3 remain, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love." So these are the greatest gifts that the Spirit gives to all people, and that love ought to be the greatest one that characterizes the Christian church. So what Paul says in the exercise of spiritual gifts, the judgment ought to be on the basis of what is best for the church, not the individual. So concentrate on those spiritual gifts of preaching and hospitality and service and mercy and things that serve and edify the body, and not so much on those individual gifts, such as speaking in tongues, although that's a gift, but it really only benefits the individual instead of the body. And then Paul finally says that the goal is a balance between mind and spirit. That is, there ought to be a balance between the more intellectual gifts of mind and then those more supernatural gifts of the spirit. Both are valid. Both can be exercised in the church, the preaching gifts and the supernatural gifts, but there ought to be a balance between the two. And one last doctrinal issue that they were concerned about was the issue of the resurrection and the resurrection of the dead, and Christians receiving a new resurrection body. Again, Gnosticism comes into play here, if the physical world is bad and the material world is bad, then some of these Corinthian Christians were saying, well, Christ didn't really rise from the dead. And we're not going to get new bodies in the new heavens and new earth because those are physical. What really matters is that we just experience a spiritual life of Christ, not a literal resurrection, and that we're just going to be spiritual beings in the new heavens and new earth. And Paul wants to correct that. And so he says here in 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ has not been raised from the dead, then our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. In other words, the resurrection is the most important part of the entire gospel, because the resurrection of Jesus, physically, literally from the tomb, is the most important thing that our faith is based on. And Paul goes on to add, he says, in the new heavens and new earth, we're going to be getting new physical bodies, because that's part of the gospel as well. So you can see that these Corinthians had a lot of issues and a lot of problems and a lot of misunderstandings. And Paul writes this letter of 1 Corinthians to give gospel responses and to correct their misinterpretations and faulty understandings.